In a strictly metaphorical sense, the Bible got it right. Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and from that moment onwards, humankind was completely separated from the rest of the species on Earth. It took a little time for the results to develop, and they came essentially in the form of language. And the acquisition of language was there ready and waiting when, for the first time, about 10,000 years ago, the human species found itself in a condition of climate which it was not accustomed to. It was the great warming of the world. We worry about global warming today. This was a different global warming, but as a result, it wiped out all those handy predators and grass-eating creatures that the primitive man and his primitive wives collecting primitive berries based their hunting-gathering lives upon. And the changed circumstances favored a different kind of behavior. And the human being, equipped with language, was able to get organized and develop that different kind of ecological behavior. And the result was farming and all the good and bad things which came from that particular civilization. And the Bible was right to recognize that. And many ancient texts have recognized that on the either side of the flood is a great difference, a great loss of innocence, and a new life with all sorts of advantages and all sorts of pressures. And farming brought with it slavery and cities and hierarchies of priests and gold and silver and so forth. But it was not the end. After about 10,000 years or so, the species, for new reasons, which are more difficult to discern, but have something to do with overcrowding and local competition, began to develop a new ecology again, an ecology of machines. And we can now see that this is what we humans do. We are unique in being able to change our entire economic, physical, and emotional relationship with the world. We live on a kind of evolutionary roller coaster. It's extraordinary that ecological evolution is not even now is not a subject in our government debates. We don't speak of ourselves as a species which does this, but we are. Now, against that background of huge change, of oscillations between divergent growth and convergent settlement, and aside from the economics which drives that, in particular, as I've written elsewhere, the economics of the plenty to the scarcity to the super scarcity curve, super scarcity occurring at the higher ecological level, higher, not better, but more potent, capable of converting more energy into more matter and into more services. That process is so huge, so impressive, that things like the arts seem to us particularly rather peripheral to it. And most notably, I think, given that we have come to the end of a long period of the arts slowly fragmenting and becoming more and more marginal. However, I want to persuade you in these next few minutes that the arts have an enormous evolutionary role to play as a kind of evolutionary lubricant in a certain sense, because they change to enable, they change the basis of our beliefs to enable us to change the basis of our ecology. And they do it in a particularly elegant way. As I've said before, we go through periods of open evolution, which favor the production of closed images. And we go through from periods of open into closed evolution, and periods of closed evolution favor the production of, or select for the production of open images. And so in that sense, we move from periods of convulsive change, when art is essentially focused on the production of aesthetic value in closed images, to periods of greater ecological settlement, when art is based on the production of open participatory images, and with a ritualistic value. And what is happening when art goes through this cycle is we move out from a world which is settled, essentially psychologically convergent and unified by some form of ritual, to a world which is divergent and which needs economically to express itself by tearing itself away from the past and starting to build a new future. Now, an art at that point, which is massive, ritualistic, and to a large degree universal, stands in the way of change. But what we saw in the Renaissance, which was the last great breakaway period in many senses, what we saw was that the art began to break up. The cathedrals began to yield up their content of images. The images went out from the churches, and they went out from the congregations in which they served in the churches, and they became closed images in themselves. They got frames around them, and they moved into quasi-temple places like art galleries, and into other quasi-temple places like palaces and grand private homes. And the closed image, breaking up into 1,000 and 1,000,000 pieces, broke away the bind on the human mind held by the old rituals. And so we saw the secularization of the world, which necessarily accompanied the period of scientific and ecological development, which finally gave us the Industrial Revolution, an even deeper and more colossal change. But there are limits to all ecological changes. The new ecology, however much at the beginning it favors a small population of the world who have the new idea and can use it to colonize, populate, and occupy other civilizations and seize their resources and use them, their populations, as slaves and servants, that process is temporary, because in the end, it is the nature of new ecologies to globalize, to move up and embrace the whole of the species. And at that point, everybody, all of us, are back in the same boat as before. There is a maximum pressure on resources. The world goes towards a universal order of scarcity, towards super scarcity at the higher level, and the conditions of a convergent world build in again. And in those circumstances of closed evolution, moving from open to closed evolution, so we see the transition from closed to open images in art. And we're already seeing that in the transition from the art object as the center of interest to the installation contextual work, and from an art which is essentially contemplative from the outside to an art which is experienced and performed from the inside. So we have that timer going off in our own civilization at the moment. And indeed, we're beginning to see the convergence of the culture as we are all mapped into the new dark cave of the IT world. So you can look at, in a sense, the evolution of art as going from dark caves in the ground through a period of when art was used for much more decorative purposes, essentially the Mesolithic, then the New Stone Age, and are going again into dark places which are now constructed, tombs and temples and ziggurats and pyramids and sacred cities, and finally cathedrals and churches and basilicas. I got them slightly out of line. And the new period of settlement and of a ritualistic art rolled on until we came with the scientific revolution of the Renaissance, which then turned quickly into the Industrial Revolution. Again, a divergent world, moving away from a well-known past, and finally, as we're beginning to see now, becoming in its own turn globalized, and its own turn beginning to generate the forms of a ritualistic, or the preforms of a ritualistic art. And what that really leaves us with is two things, I think. One is the understanding that art really follows the arrow of evolution. It binds when evolution is stable, and it breaks up and into 1,000 sparkling images when evolution is dynamic. So we go from closed images in an area of open evolution, such as we've been through, to open images in an era of closed evolution into which we are now moving. And that really completely throws the levers of belief in art, because we Westerners have thought of it as essentially an aesthetic, a source of aesthetic value, pleasure which you can either like or dislike, giving rise even to the wonderful phrase, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. That great phrase of 19th century, early 20th century amateurism, middle class amateurism. That's then gradually now going to be replaced again by an art that looks not inward and restricted to the individual view of the world, but to an attempt to summarize and understand what is really going on in the wider world to us all, starting with the energy flowing from the sun, and beyond that, the implications of an expanding universe and the potential heat death of it all in the long run. That extraordinary picture into which our lives as some people of 70 years, 70 years and 10, with all our frenzy and our capacity for good and evil, and our capacity for bumbling into pandemics and so forth. All that is contained in a single planet, which it would be foolish not to try to understand and capture in the extraordinary way that the arts can abbreviate and bring experience of a wider universe to our localized senses.